Now, because conscience is, as various saints and people in the church have said, conscience is the voice of God within a person that tells us the truth of God. Conscience has a dignity which is inalienable. And so, as Vatican II says in Gaudium et Spes, even though conscience may be mistaken, for example through innocent ignorance, it still retains its dignity. In other words, if someone is mistaken, but honestly so, then their conscience still has a dignity to it. As the Council says, it often happens that conscience goes astray through invincible ignorance, although it does not on this account lose its dignity. On the other hand, this cannot be said of the person who takes little trouble to find out what is true and good, or when conscience is by degrees almost blinded through the habit of committing sin. In other words, if someone is honestly mistaken, and the technical term in the church is invincible ignorance. In other words, when someone lacks knowledge through no fault of their own, someone like that who may have been told something by their friends, their relatives, their school, their university, even their religious community, if they've come to a conscious decision through being told something that's not true, if it's not their fault, their conscience still has dignity. What the Council drives at is that a good conscience is one when one genuinely seeks the truth, when we are open to God in our life. Now, it must be a genuine and clear conscience, not manipulative of God's revelation, but simply open to the truth. In other words, a good conscience is something not exemplified by the comedian W.C. Fields. The story goes that W.C. Fields every day would read part of the Bible, and someone asked him, "Why do you read the Bible? Because you're not a very religious man." And he said, "I'm looking for the loopholes." Looking for the loopholes. Is that good conscience? Vatican II would say, no. The Council affirms instead that when we genuinely, openly, sincerely seek the truth, if we do that and we're still mistaken, then our conscience is still dignified in the eyes of God and should be respected by us. And that applies personally to ourselves. It applies to our treatment of other people. People of different opinions, people of other faiths or of no faith. If they are sincere, if they are open, and if they've found what they believe to be the truth for themselves, even if we disagree with them, even if they're objectively wrong, their conscience still has dignity. Having said that, conscience can lose its dignity. It can be what we call culpably erroneous if we show little concern for the truth. When one's perception of right or wrong is clouded over by habitual wrongdoing. That is, for example, being desensitized to sin by habit. To keep our conscience clear and informed, as John Paul II says in Veritatis Splendor, we should always engage in the formation of conscience. We mentioned that before. So on conscience, I'd like to make 3 final points. One is to remember that humans are not infallible, and our consciences are certainly not exempt from this infallibility. So what's important is to be, firstly, gentle on ourselves. If we find that we've made a genuine decision of conscience and later find out that it's wrong, we need to remember that the genuine decision of conscience never ever loses its dignity, even if we later find out that it's wrong. Secondly, it's important to remember that we can make a genuine judgment in good conscience, but then if we find out afterwards it's wrong, that decision will be subjectively valid, but it can be objectively wrong. The reality is that no amount of good intention or dignity of conscience can alter the objective situation. But there's 2 points here. It's possible, to do one's best and still be wrong. That's true. But it's also important to remember that we never lose the dignity of conscience so long as we are genuine and acting in good faith. Thirdly, and this is a point that John Paul makes, it's an excellent point that we often forget. Conscience is the witness to us of God's truth and goodness. The reality is sometimes we go against our conscience. We sin. But as John Paul II emphasizes, conscience still reminds us of God's truth, of God's mercy, and God's forgiveness. So in the words of the Pope, the verdict of conscience remains in us as a pledge of hope and mercy, while bearing witness to the evil that we have done. It also reminds us of our need, with the help of God's grace, to ask forgiveness, to do good, and to cultivate virtue constantly. In other words, and this is the really beautiful part of Veritatis Splendor, paragraph 61, the Pope emphasizes that conscience is there to tell us, to help us discover God's truth and God's goodness, to encourage us to do good. But what about when we fail? Conscience is there to remind us that God is merciful and forgiving. And that's something that we often forget. There is so much more that could be said on freedom and conscience. If you'd like to follow up on the issue, I would strongly suggest Vatican II's document Gaudium et Spes, the Pastoral Constitution on the Church in the Modern World. I'd also strongly recommend John Paul II's Veritatis Splendor, his encyclical on the fundamentals of the Church's moral teaching. Thank you for watching, goodbye, and God bless.